very great pleasure. I introduce Amit Srivistava. Srivistava, I'm sorry.
Thank you.
From the Indian Resource Center, an Indian US-based activist. Amit.
Thank you, and thank you for coming. I wanted to share a few thoughts. We actually have, I think we're running out of time. I want to make sure everybody gets time here. We have quite a few people left. And I work with a group called the India Resource Center. We are a binational organization. We're based in the US as well as in India. And we've done significant work around climate change in India, including organizing one of the largest rallies, marches on climate or for climate justice ever. As you know, India and that region, South Asia, is some of the most vulnerable to climate change. And as you also probably know or should know, it is not a matter anymore of whether the climate is changing. The climate is changing. The climate has changed, and it is already having dramatic impacts on people around the world, but particularly the ones who are the hardest hit are those who have the least amount of resources available to them to cope with a changing climate or to adapt to a changing climate. So obviously we find across the world, across the board, that is the low-income populations across the world that are the hardest hit. And this is and also we know that the low-income people are also not very responsible for consuming or burning these fossil fuels. And this is the biggest injustice of climate change, is that those who are the hardest hit by climate change are the least responsible for creating climate change or contributing to climate change. Now, of course, we have dramatic impacts in India and as well as in South Asia, this Pakistan, Bangladesh. We are home to over 2/3 of the world's poor. The poorest of the poor in the world, 2/3 of them live in South Asia. And so we have a lot to be worried about. Now, it is interesting to talk about India nowadays in terms of the greenhouse gas emissions, because India and China, actually we're catching up to the United States and some of the larger industrialized countries in terms of our greenhouse gas emissions. In fact, our economy in India is growing at a pretty staggering rate of 9%, has been for some time according to government figures. But that also means that, this is development. This is the development based on the neoliberal model, that is prescribed by the World Bank and advocates for more investment, corporate investment. But this also directly translates to more greenhouse gases being produced by a country like India. So now, today, we are number 4. India is ranked number 4 in terms of greenhouse gas emitter in the world. And what is alarming, in a sense, is that the greenhouse gas emissions in India have doubled in just the last 10 years. And we expect that they will double again very soon. And so it is not far off, actually, that before, say, China and India are some of the top-ranked greenhouse gas emitters. But having said that, it's also very important to note that two things. One is that historically, India has not, or China has not contributed to the combination of the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. It is the industrialized countries, namely, of course, the United States, but also Western Europe, Australia, who have historically contributed significantly or mostly to the high carbon that we find in the atmosphere today. And for that reason, they must also take the lead in combating climate change. And secondly, which is very, very important, and is a principle that is big in India, is the principle of equity. And if you divide it up, the greenhouse gas emissions, and you look at per capita, so how much greenhouse gases does per person is produced, okay? What India and China produce right now per capita is very, very low. In fact, the average Indian produces only 1/16th or 1/18th of what the average American produces today. So in spite of this, having pretty high greenhouse gas emissions are catching up, we are still very far away from actually achieving, say, parity, if we want to achieve parity, with countries like the United States or even the UK for that matter. And that is a very, very important thing, because if for this to work globally, any solution must have equity at the center of it. In other words, everybody should be treated equally, and everybody should have similar or same rights to the atmosphere. And what has happened, of course, is that some have had more than others. And so India and China are catching up. I think, as the brother from Bulgaria was talking, that we have, people in India, you find many who actually live a very sustainable lifestyle, and not necessarily by choice. It's just the way it is, and they don't have the resources, and so they don't have the resources to buy a car or have an air conditioner and stuff. But there's something that we can, of course, learn from that. But of course, what is happening right now is that in terms of India's development, and this is the very important thing for us, is that we are trying to sort of catch up, of course. But what are we trying to catch up to? Well, we're trying to catch up to what America is like today, for example, or what it is like here in England today. We are trying to kind of ape the West, and this is not done in isolation. It's not as if some Indian politicians or policymakers have just decided that that's what we want to be and they're doing it on their own. No, they actually have a lot of help, and they have a lot of help, and not just help, but they have a lot. Sometimes their hands are tied in a way, but they're influenced heavily by interests in the West as well. Namely, your institutions like the World Bank or the IMF or the Asian Development Bank, and large corporations who have worked very hard to open up the Indian economic borders so that they can come in and do business and make and sort of gear the economy so that it's export oriented and sort of mirrors what the United States economy looks like. And to be very frank, now when I go to India, there are parts of India that looks pretty much like what it looks like in the United States or here in the UK. We have malls, we have lots of cars, we have toll bridges, we have toll roads, we have 5-lane motorways. This is pretty new for India, the extent of this. And what is very problematic about this is that while we welcome growth, we need growth, we need development in India. We have too many people in India who do not have your basic things that one should have, the fundamental human rights, things like housing and access to decent food and access to water. So we need to develop. But what is happening with this current model of development is that the actual gap between the haves and the have-nots is actually getting bigger. And it just doesn't make sense. If you put it in the context of climate change, it's going to make the impacts even worse for the poorest of the poor, because they're getting poorer as a result of this current economic development, or this development model that India has undertaken along with its partners around the world. So we actually have a lot of problems in India, and so we're very happy to be here to sort of engage with movements and campaigns in Europe and elsewhere who have done actually a lot more on climate change and have examined the politics of climate change more, and we hope to sort of engage with that. I just want to end by just mentioning some challenges. I think it mirrors some that was mentioned from Bulgaria, but we have India and perhaps Brazil are arguably have the most sophisticated and strongest social movements in the world today. We have no shortage of activists, we have no shortage of issues, and so we have people out on the streets regularly and very vibrant social movement. However, when you engage with the social movements in India about climate change, when you bring up climate change, the usual response you get is, it's not our problem, it's their problem. They're meaning the West or the North. But really, nothing could be further from the truth, right? Yes, there is a problem of lifestyles in the West, or consumerism in the West, which has resulted in this crisis. But in terms of the impacts, it is being borne disproportionately